What if I told you that one of the world's most ambitious engineering projects became the center of one of the deadliest disasters in human history, a disaster so devastating that, for years, much of the world barely knew it had happened? August 1975, China's Henan Province had been under relentless rain for days. At first, it seemed like another powerful monsoon. Farmers stayed in their fields. Children went to school. Families carried on with their daily lives, believing the storm would eventually pass. But high in the mountains, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Every hour, rivers swelled higher. Streams turned into raging torrents. An unimaginable amount of water was racing toward a massive concrete structure that millions of people trusted with their safety. That structure was the Banqiao Dam, built to control floods, generate electricity, and protect entire communities. The Banqiao Dam represented China's determination to harness the power of nature. It was considered a remarkable engineering achievement of its time, designed to keep disaster away, not invite it. Yet within a matter of hours, that very symbol of protection would become the source of unimaginable destruction. How could a dam built to save lives end up taking so many? Was it simply the overwhelming force of nature? Or did human decisions turn a natural disaster into one of the worst engineering catastrophes ever recorded? To answer those questions, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the Banqiao Dam existed only as a bold vision on paper. A vision fueled by hope, ambition, and the promise of a safer future, but hidden beneath that promise were warnings that few people were willing to hear, warnings that, years later, would prove to be tragically important. And when the skies finally opened over central China in the summer of 1975, history was about to change forever. The story of the Banqiao Dam didn't begin with disaster, it began with hope. For generations, the Ru River had been both a blessing and a curse. It brought water that nourished crops, but when heavy rains arrived, it often flooded nearby villages, destroying homes, farmland, and livelihoods. After the founding of the People's Republic of China, controlling these floods became a national priority. Across the country, large dams were seen as symbols of progress. They promised electricity, irrigation, and protection from nature's worst disasters. The Banqiao Dam was one of those ambitious projects. Construction began in the early 1950s. Engineers designed it to tame the river and safeguard millions of people living downstream. At the time, it was celebrated as a major achievement of modern engineering. For years, it appeared to do exactly what it had been built to do, but not everyone believed the design was prepared for every possibility. Among the experts was a respected hydrologist named Qin Xing. He studied the plans carefully and raised concerns about the dam's flood control capacity. His argument was simple: nature doesn't always follow human calculations. He warned that an extreme rainfall event could overwhelm the reservoir. In his view, the dam needed greater spillway capacity so that massive volumes of water could be released safely during extraordinary storms. His concerns were technical, not political. But in an era focused on rapid development, many of those recommendations were never fully adopted. Later historical accounts indicate that Qin Xing's views were largely set aside, and he was eventually removed from the project. At the time, few imagined that those warnings would ever matter. As the years passed, the Banqiao Dam successfully controlled several floods. Confidence grew stronger with every rainy season. Farms flourished. Reservoirs supplied water. Communities felt safer than ever before, to many people. It seemed that modern engineering had finally brought one of China's most unpredictable rivers under control, but history has a way of humbling that kind of confidence, because nature doesn't care how impressive a structure looks, or how carefully it was designed, it only follows its own rules. Then came the summer of 1975, out over the Pacific Ocean, a powerful tropical storm was gathering strength. Meteorologists gave it a name, Typhoon Nina. No one knew that within days, it would unleash rainfall so extraordinary that it would push one of the world's largest engineering projects far beyond its limits. And once the storm reached central China, everything began to change. By early August 1975, Typhoon Nina had already carved a path of destruction across eastern China, but instead of weakening as expected after moving inland, the storm stalled over Henan Province. What happened next shocked even experienced meteorologists. Hour after hour, the rain refused to stop, entire hillsides disappeared behind sheets of water. Rivers burst from their banks. Small streams transformed into violent torrents, carrying enormous volumes of water toward the valleys below. Then came the unimaginable. In some areas, more than a year's worth of rainfall fell within just 24 hours. Weather stations recorded levels far beyond what many forecasting models of the time had anticipated. It was no longer just a storm, it was a disaster unfolding in real time. At the Banqiao Dam, engineers watched the reservoir rise faster than anyone had expected. The spillway gates were open to release as much water as possible, but there was a terrifying problem. The amount of water flowing into the reservoir was far greater than the amount flowing out. Every passing hour made the situation worse. And Banqiao wasn't facing the crisis alone. Dozens of reservoirs and dams across the region were also filling rapidly. Water from mountains, rivers, and upstream reservoirs was converging into the same river system, placing enormous pressure on every structure downstream. Meanwhile, the storm was beginning to cripple communication. Heavy rain damaged roads, interrupted power supplies, and disrupted telephone and telegraph lines in many areas. As conditions deteriorated, sharing accurate information became increasingly difficult. For the engineers inside the control room, every decision mattered. Release too much water too quickly, and communities downstream could flood. Release too little, and the reservoir would continue rising toward dangerous levels. There was no easy choice. While officials struggled to manage the growing crisis, life continued below the dam. Families stayed inside their homes, waiting for the storm to pass. Children slept through the sound of relentless rain. Farmers hoped their crops would survive another day. Few of them realized that billions of cubic meters of water were gathering just beyond the concrete wall above them. Then the numbers on the monitoring instruments climbed higher and higher. The safety margins engineers had once relied upon were rapidly disappearing. The Banqiao Dam, built to withstand powerful floods, was approaching a level of stress it had never faced before. The storm showed no sign of stopping. The reservoir continued to rise, and somewhere in the darkness, time was running out. The night of August 8, 1975, was unlike any other. The rain was still pounding the landscape. Inside the Banqiao Dam, engineers were doing everything they could to keep the reservoir under control. The spillway gates remained open, but it wasn't enough. The inflow was simply too great. Every minute, more water poured into the reservoir than the dam could safely release. The pressure kept building. Outside, thousands of families had no idea how close they were to catastrophe. Most were asleep, others were waiting for the storm to ease. No one could see what was happening behind the massive concrete wall that towered above them. Then, the impossible happened. After enduring overwhelming pressure from the unprecedented floodwaters, the Banqiao Dam failed. In an instant, the reservoir that had held back an immense volume of water for years was unleashed. A gigantic wall of water exploded downstream. It wasn't an ordinary flood. It was a violent surge powerful enough to sweep away almost everything in its path. Within minutes, villages disappeared beneath the rushing water. Homes were ripped from their foundations, roads collapsed, bridges vanished, trees that had stood for decades were torn from the ground as if they weighed nothing. The darkness made the disaster even more terrifying. Many people never saw the flood coming. Some were awakened only by the sound of crashing water. Others had only seconds to react. Survivors later described an unforgettable scene. The roar of the water was deafening. Entire houses drifted past in the current. People clung to rooftops, tree branches, or anything they could hold on to, hoping to survive. But the disaster was only beginning. The collapse of the Banqiao Dam sent an enormous flood wave racing through the river system. Downstream, several other dams were suddenly forced to absorb a volume of water far beyond their design limits. One after another, many of them also failed. Engineers refer to this as a cascade failure, a chain reaction in which the collapse of one structure triggers the failure of others. The flood grew larger, more powerful, more destructive. Communities that had never imagined they were in danger suddenly found themselves directly in its path. Across central Henan, the landscape was transformed in just a few hours. What had started as an extraordinary storm had become one of the deadliest dam disasters in recorded history, and when the sun finally rose the next morning, the true scale of the tragedy was only beginning to reveal itself. When daylight finally broke, the storm had begun to fade, but what it revealed was almost impossible to comprehend. entire villages had vanished, fields that once stretched for miles were now swallowed by water, roads had disappeared beneath thick layers of mud, and countless homes had simply ceased to exist. For many survivors, the first hours after the flood were filled with confusion. Parents searched desperately for their children. Children wandered through the wreckage looking for their families. Some people found themselves completely alone, surrounded by silence where thriving communities had stood just a day before, but surviving the flood was only the beginning. Across the devastated region, thousands of people were stranded on rooftops, trees, and patches of higher ground. Many had no clean drinking water, no food, no medicine, and no way to call for help. The disaster had destroyed much of the area's transportation and communication infrastructure. Bridges had been washed away, roads were impassable. In many places, rescue teams simply couldn't reach those who needed them most. As the days passed, another tragedy unfolded. Many victims did not die in the flood itself. According to historical records, large numbers of deaths occurred in the days and weeks that followed due to starvation, dehydration, disease, and the collapse of essential services. The disaster had become far more than a dam failure. It had become a humanitarian catastrophe. Even today, the exact death toll remains uncertain. For years, only limited information about the disaster was made public. Later historical studies and official records suggested that the combined direct and indirect death toll was likely between 170,000 and 230,000 people. Because different sources use different methods of estimation, historians continue to debate the precise figure. But on one point, there is little disagreement. The Banqiao Dam disaster ranks among the deadliest dam failures in human history. The destruction extended far beyond the loss of life. Millions of people were affected. Farmland was devastated. Harvests were destroyed, livestock was swept away. Entire communities faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding their lives from almost nothing. Yet one of the most remarkable parts of this story wasn't the flood itself. It was the silence that followed. For decades, much of the world knew very little about what had happened in Henan in 1975. Detailed reports remained largely unavailable outside China, and only years later did researchers begin piecing together the full story through historical documents, engineering studies, and declassified records. As more information emerged, one question kept resurfacing. Was this tragedy simply the result of an extraordinary natural disaster, or had human decisions made an already catastrophic event even worse? The answer would forever change the way engineers, governments, and disaster experts think about dam safety around the world. As researchers and engineers began examining the disaster in the years that followed, one thing became clear: the Banqiao Dam disaster was not caused by a single failure. It was the result of several extraordinary events colliding at the worst possible moment. First, there was Typhoon Nina. The storm produced rainfall on a scale few people had ever witnessed. In some locations, precipitation shattered historical records, overwhelming rivers, reservoirs, and flood control systems across the region. By itself, this was an exceptionally rare natural event. But nature was only part of the story. Experts also looked closely at the dam's design. Years before construction was completed, hydrologist Chen Xing had warned that the spillway capacity might not be sufficient if an extreme storm ever struck the region. He argued that flood control systems should be designed with larger safety margins to account for events beyond normal expectations. At the time, many of those recommendations were not fully adopted. That doesn't mean the disaster can be blamed on one decision or one individual. Modern investigations generally conclude that the tragedy resulted from a combination of unprecedented weather, engineering limitations, communication failures, and the disaster management capabilities of that era. In other words, it was a chain of events, and once that chain began to break, stopping it became nearly impossible. The disaster transformed the way engineers around the world thought about risk. Instead of asking, "Can this structure handle an average flood?" they began asking a much more important question: can it survive the flood no one expects? That single change in thinking has influenced dam engineering ever since. Following the Banqiao disaster, China gradually reviewed the safety of many dams and reservoirs. Over time, improvements were made to flood forecasting, emergency planning, structural inspections, and reservoir management. Similar lessons were studied internationally as engineers sought to reduce the risk of comparable disasters. Today, modern dams are monitored with technologies that engineers in 1975 could only imagine. Satellites track approaching storms. Advanced weather models predict rainfall days in advance. Sensors continuously monitor structural movement, water pressure, and changes inside the dam itself. Emergency warning systems can alert entire communities within minutes, but despite all these advances, no technology can eliminate risk completely. Climate change is increasing the frequency of extreme weather events in many parts of the world. Storms are becoming more intense, rainfall is becoming less predictable, and aging infrastructure in many countries faces challenges it was never originally designed to withstand. That's why the Banqiao Dam disaster remains more than just a historical tragedy. It is a warning. A reminder that engineering is not only about building bigger and stronger structures, it's about preparing for the unimaginable, because when nature pushes beyond every prediction, even the strongest walls can be tested, and sometimes, the greatest disasters begin long before the first crack appears. Nearly 50 years have passed since the Banqiao Dam disaster. The floodwaters are gone, the villages have been rebuilt, new generations now live where one of history's greatest engineering tragedies once unfolded, but the lessons of Banqiao have never disappeared. Today, thousands of large dams stand across the world. They provide electricity, they irrigate farmland, they store precious water. And they protect millions of people from seasonal floods. They are among humanity's greatest engineering achievements, yet every one of them carries the same responsibility, to withstand not only today's challenges, but tomorrow's uncertainties. The Banqiao disaster reminds us that concrete alone cannot guarantee safety. True safety depends on careful planning, independent scientific expertise, transparent decision-making, regular maintenance, reliable emergency warning systems, and the willingness to listen when experts raise uncomfortable questions. History has shown us this lesson many times, not through one disaster, but through many, again and again. Humanity has learned that the greatest catastrophes rarely happen because of a single mistake. More often, they occur when a series of small decisions, overlooked warnings, and unexpected events come together at exactly the wrong moment. Banqiao is one of the clearest examples of that reality. It wasn't simply a story about a dam, it was a story about human ambition, about our determination to reshape nature, and about the responsibility that comes with that power. Because nature doesn't negotiate, it doesn't recognize political borders. It doesn't care about engineering awards or national pride, it follows only the laws of physics, and when those laws are underestimated, the consequences can last for generations. Today, the Banqiao Dam disaster is remembered not only as one of the deadliest dam failures in history, but also as a turning point in modern disaster management and dam engineering. Its legacy lives on in stronger safety standards, improved flood forecasting, and better emergency planning around the world. The people who lost their lives in 1975 cannot be brought back, but the lessons learned from their tragedy continue to protect millions of others. Perhaps that is why the story of Banqiao still matters today, not because it belongs to the past, but because it continues to shape the future. And maybe the most important question this disaster leaves us with is not, how did the Banqiao Dam fail, but, are we truly prepared for the next disaster that no one believes could happen? Because history has a habit of repeating itself, especially when its warnings are forgotten.